So Canada just spent $305 million to make sure Elon Musk or Donald Trump will never hold the switch to our national security systems again.
And Europe? Europe just turned down the cheapest rocket on the planet. Not because it stopped working, but because they finally understood something Canada understood too. When someone else owns the infrastructure your country runs on, that is not a service contract, that is a leash.
And this is the story of how two of the world's most stable democracies just looked at the New World Order, looked at what American power has become under Trump, and decided, hey, we're done being dependent.
So stay with us, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why this matters and why Canada is actually ahead of where most people think.
So to understand why Europe and Canada are spending these billions of dollars right now, you have to go back to Ukraine.
When Russia invaded, Ukraine became almost entirely dependent on Starlink, Elon Musk's private satellite network for battlefield communications. It was fast, it was effective, and it was the best thing available. And then Musk started to become a Trump sycophant. Coverage decisions were reportedly made unilaterally, and European governments watched a democratic country fighting for its survival realize that its most critical communication infrastructure was sitting on one man's server, a man who was increasingly answering to Washington, or maybe just to his crazy self.
And that was the moment the calculation changed, because dependence feels efficient right up until the day it becomes leverage. You don't worry much about who owns the bridge when the traffic is moving. You start worrying the moment the owner starts making political speeches and everyone suddenly realizes that the toll booth, it can become a weapon.
Europe noticed, Canada noticed, and they both started spending. Europe's answer is called IRIS², which is basically Europe's version of Starlink. It's a planned network of about 290 satellites designed to provide encrypted, secure communications for European governments. Communications that no private American company, no Trump rambling message, and no Musk tweet can interrupt.
The European Union is pouring 10.6 billion euro into it. And even as they do it, they openly admit that Starlink is still faster, cheaper, and more capable right now. And that tells you how serious this is. They're choosing to pay more on purpose.
Think of it this way. If your neighborhood loses power during an ice storm, and the only generator available belongs to a neighbor who has been making strange speeches lately and seems to be getting closer to a crazy man like Trump, well, you don't borrow his generator. You buy your own. Even if it costs more, even if it takes time to install, because some risks are just too expensive to save money on.
And that is exactly what Europe is doing. Not because Musk's Falcon 9 forgot how to launch, but because Europe's finally understanding that infrastructure is power, and power in someone else's hands is vulnerability, not a resource.
And here's where Canada comes in. Here's where the story gets interesting for us.
Yes. Prime Minister Mark Carney just announced a $200 million investment in Canadian-owned spaceport near Coercion, Nova Scotia, plus another $105 million through the Launch the North program to build up sovereign launch capacity, which basically means just Canada's ability to put its own satellites into orbit on its own terms from its own soil.
And that is $305 million saying, if space is now part of national security, Canada needs to own its way up.
The government's own language is worth reading carefully. It says, and I'm going to quote directly here, that sovereign access to space has become a critical capability for national security, economic competitiveness, and reliable access to essential services.
And here's what that means in normal human terms. Every time you check the weather forecast, use GPS navigation, make a credit card transaction, or watch a search and rescue operation run smoothly in a northern community, satellites made that possible. Your modern life is literally sitting on top of a network of orbiting technology. The question is, who owns that technology? And what happens if they decide to make demands?
Canada is now building the answer to that question. And it's not a small answer either.
Now, let's talk about Elon Musk, because we all know that Musk is an evil man, but we also don't want to miss the real point here.
Yeah, SpaceX didn't become a problem because it failed. It became a concern because it succeeded spectacularly. It became so central, so dominant, so far ahead of everyone else that the government started running calculations they'd never run before. What happens if we need this system in a real emergency and the person who owns it has his own foreign policy? What happens if the price doubles? Hey, what happens if there's a delay because Washington told him to delay?
Or if you just woke up in the middle of the night high on ketamine and thought, hey, this would be fun to shut down. This all sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's not. It's just a cold-eyed risk assessment and applies to any single external actor, American, European, Chinese, or otherwise.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. And the lesson here is simple. A system can be brilliant and still be a strategic risk if too much depends on one outside person. And that's the part that governments are finally taking seriously.
Yeah, Europe is spending 10.6 billion euros because they finally understood that lesson. Canada is spending $305 million for the same reason. And Europe is not just building hardware, they are building legal weapons too.
Yeah, there's something called the EU anti-coercion instrument, which in plain terms basically is a legal panic button for economic blackmail. You may have heard it referred to as the trade bazooka. Remember when Trump was talking about taking over Greenland?
Basically, it says this: if a country outside the EU tries to pressure Europe politically through trade threats, investment restrictions, or tariff weapons, the instrument gives the European Commission the power to examine it, the Council the power to formally declare coercion, and the whole bloc the ability to hit back with economic penalties.
So you put that alongside the IRIS² satellite network, alongside Canada's sovereign spaceport, alongside reports that Europe is now building its own payment alternative to Visa and MasterCard because of fears about being cut off from the US financial infrastructure. And what do you see? Well, you start to see a pattern. This is not random. These are pieces of the same puzzle.
For Canada especially, there is one more layer that makes all of this urgent in a way that doesn't apply to France or Germany. It's the Arctic.
Yep. Mark Carney's government has unveiled the $35 billion Arctic Defense Plan. NATO just ran Cold Response 2026, where there was 25,000 troops from 14 countries, now folded into a permanent Arctic sentry mission. The reason is simple. The Arctic is no longer an empty white postcard at the top of the map.
It is shipping lanes, military access, military positioning, and surveillance corridors. And right now, with Greenland under political pressure, with Russian activity increasing, and with American signals becoming harder to read, Canada's ability to see, communicate, and operate independently in that environment is just not something that is nice to have. It's the difference between real northern sovereignty and a decorative one.
Yeah. Basically, if you cannot launch, monitor, and communicate on your own in that environment, then your sovereignty is not sovereignty at all. It's a rental agreement.
So here's what we want you to take away from all of this. A few years ago, globalization felt like permanent good weather. It was built for efficiency. You chase the lowest cost, trust the supply chains, trust the vendors, and trust the infrastructure, even if it's foreign.
And then came Russian energy coercion in Europe, supply chain collapsing during COVID, Trump's tariff threats, heck, Musk's growing political presence. And all of a sudden, those efficiency decisions started looking like they were built on someone else's terms.
The countries now paying extra for backups, for local control, or for the right to say no without being strangled by their own dependencies, well, those countries are going to be in a much stronger position in the decade ahead.
Think of it like buying winter tires. It's a good reference. You grumble at the bill in October. You're extremely grateful when January comes around and everyone else is sliding off the road.
Well, Canada is buying winter tires, and Europe is buying winter tires. The USA is still running on bald summer tires. And while Trump's America is busy chasing the next loud headline, the next war, the next country, other countries are quietly building the infrastructure they may need to survive the next several years.
Now, we're used to thinking of sovereignty in old school terms, right? Like border, flag, troops, ships, and that all, it still matters. But modern sovereignty also means launch pads, cloud systems, payment rails, semiconductor access, critical minerals, heck, undersea cables and satellite networks. And if you do not own enough of the machinery underneath your country, then a lot of your political freedom is really just a rental agreement with somebody else.
IRIS² is not a vanity project, and Canada's sovereign spaceport is not a government handout. These are insurance policies for a nastier century ahead. And right now, Canada is not behind the curve on this at all. Canada is actually writing the rules.
So now we want to know what you think. In 10 years, will Canada's investment into the sovereign space infrastructure look like brilliant long-term strategy? Or will it turn out that Musk and the Americans stayed reliable enough that the billions were overkill?
Drop your prediction in the comments because we read everyone even if we don't reply to them all.
And remember, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to support this channel and keep it independent, check the links down in the pinned comment to the A-Team and our merch store where you can help us do just that.
You'll also find Substack where you will go a deeper dives with a little more sass. Thanks for watching, everybody, and we shall see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.